reprise au débat. The honourable member for Souris Moose Mountain.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm glad I have a chance to speak on C-45 regarding the legalization of cannabis across Canada. I would like to recognize the work of my colleague, the member from Sarnia-Lambton, and thank her for the tireless efforts in ensuring that all aspects of this matter are considered before this legislation moves forward. There are many areas of concern surrounding this bill, mainly in the areas of how the legalization of cannabis will affect the general health of our population, and also regarding the issues surrounding youth. I myself have had some deep-rooted concerns about what the legalization of cannabis could do to Canada's youth, and will discuss these concerns in my remarks. Madam Speaker, I think that it is necessary to point out just how rushed this piece of legislation is. The government has set an arbitrary date of July 1st, 2018 for the legalization of cannabis. This means that by that date, all the provinces and territories, including the municipalities and the police forces within these regions, will need to have implemented the legislation that allows members of the public to access recreational marijuana. This is a huge ask. There needs to be a time for the appropriate authorities to figure out just how they're going to handle this new endeavour. It is a serious matter and should absolutely not be rushed. I worry that the Liberals are more focused on keeping a campaign promise than they are about the health and safety of our communities here in Canada. Indeed, this is one promise that we wish they wouldn't keep, given the wide-ranging implications that it could have on society. This legislation needs to be picked apart with a fine-tooth comb to ensure that every aspect of it is considered by the provinces and territories, whose responsibility it is going to be to implement it. Less than 1 year from now is not enough time, and the government needs to realize that. Madam Speaker, in my previous life before becoming a Member of Parliament, I was a chiropractor in my hometown of Estevan. Having a medical background allows me to see this bill through that lens and gives me a unique perspective on just how the legalization of cannabis could affect the general health of our country. I have also been very involved with sport in both a medical capacity and as a coach for youth. So I will draw upon those experiences when discussing the use of recreational cannabis. As most of the members of this House likely know, Bill C-45 recommends at the age of 18 as a federal minimum for access to recreational cannabis. While the provinces are being given the power to set a higher age, the federal legislation puts it at 18. This creates an issue from a medical perspective, given what we should all know and what healthcare professionals have testified before committee, that the brain continues to develop until the age of 25. In fact, increased use of cannabis before the age of 25 increases one's risk of developing mental disorders such as schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety by up to 30% compared to those that have not used cannabis under the age of 25. This is a very significant number and should not be ignored. For this reason, the Canadian Medical Association, or CMA, recommends raising the age at which a person can consume cannabis to at least 21. This reflects the assumption that if the age is raised too high, illegal consumption of cannabis will continue. Madam Speaker, I need to reiterate and point out again the fact that the CMA is bending when they say that the minimum age of cannabis consumption should be 21. All scientific evidence to this point states that there are significantly increased risks for the use of cannabis under the age of 25. And I believe that it is simply irresponsible for the government to set the minimum age at 18, let alone at 21. This also leads me to the question, what is this government's motivation? They say that they are the party of scientists and constantly remind us of just how important science is. And yet on this issue, they're choosing to ignore the facts. It is clear and utter hypocrisy. The science is clear on this health issue. Could this be because they're trying to appeal to a younger demographic of voters in hopes that they will win the next election? Is it appropriate for them to ignore the health and safety of young Canadians so that they can rush through legislation that will make them appealing to young voters? Furthermore, if it comes out 10 years from now that the effects of cannabis use are much more damaging than was initially thought, as it was with tobacco, will this government be responsible for that? Given that there isn't a plethora of medical-based research on the long-term effects of cannabis use, and given how rushed this piece of legislation is, will these Liberals take accountability for the results of legalizing recreational cannabis use? I think not. I do not want to be the person who said, "I told you so," but I will. The Liberals need to do their job to ensure the health and safety of all Canadians, and this bill simply does not do that. Madam Speaker, another issue that I have with this bill, and that many others have expressed to me, is to do with the marketing and more specifically the packaging. All Canadians know that in recent years there has been a serious crackdown on how tobacco is marketed. We have all seen the grisly warnings on cigarette packaging, and I am sure that many of us are familiar with the idea of plain packaging and other measures that serve to deter people from tobacco use. We know the consequences of smoking tobacco, such as breathing problems, emphysema, and lung cancer. But 50 years ago, we did not. When this happens with cannabis, who will pay that bill? It will be the taxpayer once again, whom the Liberals have no problem in deferring their expenses to. Bill C-45 has absolutely zero provisions with respect to how cannabis can be marketed. While tobacco products need to be covered in warnings and hidden from view behind a store counter, cannabis will be allowed to have bright, flashy packaging with no limitations as to how it can be marketed. To me, this is a clear double standard. Both products are harmful to your health. So why is one regulated and the other isn't? It is yet another major oversight that this bill does not deal with. Of course, there's also the matter of public safety in general, and how the legalization of cannabis could have serious negative impacts on the well-being of Canadians. With respect to drug-impaired driving, the issue is simply not addressed at all in Bill C-45. A recent study by the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and Addiction put the cost of impaired driving from cannabis at $1 billion. If we look at our neighbours down south in the USA that have legalized recreational cannabis, we see that there has been a dramatic increase in the involvement of cannabis users in fatal car accidents. Not to mention the fact that there is currently no instrument that can accurately measure a person's level of impairment when you're roadside. We cannot forget that the impact of this legislation will have on our businesses, manufacturers, and employers. There are too many questions and no answers about the liability and workplace safety. This will affect on-the-job employee performance. But again, how do we test for this? The increased cost for the employer to put in policy, procedure, and implementation will further add to the increased economic burden they are already experiencing under this government. The legal technicalities and challenges will be astronomical, not to mention the cost to train a police officer, which will be charged to municipal governments as well as provincial and federal police agencies. Madam Speaker, it is absolutely irresponsible to move forward with legislation that is clearly missing some major provisions that would keep our country and Canadians safe. There needs to be some sort of public education program before the legislation is put in place. And I repeat, before the legislation is put in place, so that Canadians, and especially our youth, can actually understand the risks associated with partaking in recreational cannabis. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, even 9 months, assuming education starts today, is not enough. It astounds me that this was not considered by the federal government when drafting this legislation. And as with other matters, such as the framework for palliative care, I would not be surprised to hear that they are hefting the responsibility over to the provinces and territories, rather than taking on this task themselves. This government needs to put their grown-up pants on and take on the responsibility to look at all aspects of this legislation instead of focusing on what makes them look cool. Madam Speaker, in conclusion, we on this side of the House oppose the legalization of recreational cannabis based on evidence and testimony from professionals such as doctors, lawyers, scientists, law enforcement officials, and many others. We will do everything possible to ensure that cannabis does not end up in the hands of children, something that this bill would actually allow. Unlike the Prime Minister, we will listen to the experts on this matter who say the bill is flawed. I call on the government to stand up and do what is in the best interest of Canadians, and not what is in the best interest of their political goals. This issue is more than politics. It is the health and safety and well-being of our country that is on the line here. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Yeah.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Madam Speaker, just to provide some reassurance to my colleague across the way, he speaks about the lack of legislation dealing with impaired. I'd remind him that just last week this House passed Bill C-46 in third reading. His party did not vote for that bill, but that bill provides all the authorities now required to keep our roadways safe. And we've included in the passage of that bill, as it heads to the Senate, a promise of all the money that has been asked for and required to train the police and to provide them with the technologies. He mentioned that he's concerned about the lack of regulations regarding packaging, promotion, advertising, etc. The legislation does allow for that, and those regulations are also under development. He talked about the public education campaign. Our government has committed $46 million for that training. And finally, he talks about the expertise. Madam Speaker, about 18 months ago, we formed a task force. That task force had representatives and experts from the areas of public safety, justice, public health, and problematic substance use. They've received over 30,000 submissions from Canadians across the country. They received over 700 written submissions, and they held hearings in every region of this country where they heard from literally hundreds of experts. Based on that testimony, they provided a series of recommendations to this government, which this government took very, very seriously. We have, in fact, engaged very broadly with that level of expertise. This is public policy based entirely on that evidence, and I hope, in the knowledge of that, will provide some of the reassurance that my friend opposite seeks.
The Honourable Member for